And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Well, at Byline TV and Byline Times, we've covered crony contracts and crony appointments. But what about cronyism in the media? Is that at the heart of the corruption of the British state? Well, we'll be joined in the studio by two Byline Times writers, Wright and Professor Brian Cathcart, to discuss exactly that and see what's in the news and what isn't in the news.
But before that, the continuing refugee crisis. Now, Byline TV wants to follow the story and keep investigating, even once the mainstream news cameras stop rolling. So this week, we have a special report speaking to refugees at Dunkirk. And we'll also be speaking to Ed McConnell, who's a news editor at Kent Online, about why he felt the need to speak out against those who were saying that the 31 people who lost their lives drowning in the Channel last week deserved to die.
And as we've often reported on Byline Times, coronavirus isn't going away that quickly. We'll be talking to Dr Deepti Gurdasani about the Omicron variant and what that means for us and our plans for Christmas.
And speaking of Christmas, rumours of a staff bash held at Downing Street this time last year when Tier 3 restrictions were introduced in the capital to combat the spread of the coronavirus crisis has dominated this week at Westminster. But can Boris Johnson get through this latest rule-breaking scandal? And can the opposition parties finally capitalise on it? Our producer, George Llewellyn, will be speaking to our chief Westminster correspondent, Adam Bienkov.
Now, no one from Byline Times or Byline TV was invited to a number 10 Christmas party last year, because we don't do that. Nor are we funded by hedge funds or the license fee or anything like that. We are funded by one source and one source alone, and that is you. It's your subscriptions that make this happen, that employ our amazing young TV team. And you can help us. We have broken even. We are still losing money. So if you went to patreon.com/Byline TV, you could sign up and support us. Same on YouTube. You can support, if you're watching on YouTube, there's a little button in the right-hand corner. And it's not just for nothing, because if you sign up, what happens, Hardeep?
Yes, well, if you sign up, then you can join our After Dark Q&A, which is held every week after the live show finishes. And we'll be joined this week, myself and Peter, with Brian Cathcart and Wright. So as Peter says, just hit the join button on YouTube or sign up on patreon.com.
And of course, every month, we do a print edition. That will happen next 2 weeks' time on the print edition, Hardeep. But we do a digital front page every Friday and then collapse and then do the TV show. And our digital front page is the same as the TV show this week, isn't it? And it is Britain's crony media. Some stories there, some important stories, some breaking stories from a special investigation.
Two stories this week, Peter, which lead our digital front page. A special investigation into the Independent and Evening Standard newspapers, which are owned by Lord Evgeny Lebedev.
Of Siberia
yes,
and Hampton.
A baron who sits in the House of Lords, put there by his good friend, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. But these investigations are about the fact that both newspapers published a number of positive stories with regards to Saudi Arabia and issues to do with climate change and the environment around the COP26 UN Climate Summit, which took place last month. A number of these stories were published under a deal, a commercial deal, which these newspapers have with regards to Saudi Arabia. And many of them were labelled as partner content, but some were not. And so our investigation really raises questions about, again, transparency, editorial independence, and subsequent to us reporting on this, the Advertising Standards Authority, which is the advertising watchdog, has said that it will be looking into any articles that were published without the partner content label on them. And they'll also be taking a wider look at this relationship that these two newspapers have with Saudi Arabia.
And their owners and who funds them will be. Obviously, there's two more articles on the front page, one by Wright about old journalists coming back. I saw a slight take since I'm not of the younger age group.
It was a headline I wrote.
You
the
wrote
old
that headline.
hacks
You're to blame.
renaissance.
Okay, but he has.
But we were
more.
referring to the sort of the big beasts that seem to be sort of moving around elite positions in our establishment media, and posing questions about how that might impact on newer, younger, more interesting blood.
And Brian Cathcart, Professor Brian Cathcart, also has a piece on the front page about a report on Islamophobia in the Spectator, which is owned by the Barclay brothers. And of course, we'll have to talk with Brian and Mick about the Rothermeres who own the Mail and what's happened in court with Meghan Markle. So that's our front page. Do read more if you can on there. Go to bylinetimes.com, and you can also subscribe to the newspaper and get the print edition, which will be out in about 2 weeks' time.
But first, last week, the story of the 31 people who died while crossing the Channel on their way to Britain shocked Britain. Now, while politicians and the government said that we apparently need to crack down on these so-called illegal immigrants and stop the people who are trafficking them, what about the human face of the refugee crisis? Now, Byline TV wants to go and find out what was happening to people who are willing to risk their lives in this way and keep following this story even as the mainstream media moves on. So this week we have a special report for you from Dunkirk by our producers Ollie Cole and Louis Hagan.
We're here, northern France, Dunkirk, Christmas lights in the shops, music playing in the streets, and people are treated like this. It's bitterly cold. The wind just cuts right through you, and the politics is just hostile. The way people are treated, the constant evictions, the way that the police just they'll slash the tents, they'll take the sleeping bags, and then they'll throw everything else in the street, in the bushes. It's a very busy main road by us. There's industrial yards and heavy train traffic, and people are pushed, marginalised out, into the bushes, out of sight, out of mind, and the politics doesn't listen. And this is not the way to treat people. People deserve respect, people deserve dignity, and people deserve to be listened to.
If we go back, we die. So that's last chance. Or we die, or we get life.
Can I ask you, you look quite young. How old are you?
I'm 17. Yeah. And I came on my own, by myself.
What was it like travelling from Kurdistan all the way to Dunkirk?
Don't remind me. Terrible. It was terrible. I get on the lorry, under the lorry, where's the axle? We get on the axle under the tires, the tires. There is one axle, we get on the axle, then come to Europe. We got, already is fight over there. I know, we get killed every day. People, kids, they doesn't show it on media, on the TVs. That's the truth.
Did you hear about last week?
The boat.
The boats.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on the boat?
I think I knew one of not my friends. I just saw him here. I know him from here. Yeah, he's dead. And it might be my future the same. I don't know. I might die. Who knows? Who cares?
And now we're joined by Ed McConnell, who's the news editor of Kent Online. Ed, thank you so much for your time this evening. So when Kent Online reported the incident with regards to the 31 people who drowned in the Channel last week, what was the reaction that those stories generated from your readership, Ed?
People celebrating the deaths, really. reacting with sort of laughing emojis, posting horrific comments. So there was that as well, and that's what we tried to challenge in this report this week.
These people disparaging remarks, saying that they deserve to die, these migrants, these refugees, as they nearly always turn out to be, and that they were rapists and murderers. You did that. What was the response? And you wrote this up, didn't you? Did you get any traction? Did you understand where these people's views came from? Did they change their views, when you challenged them?
No, they didn't. None of them changed their views. I don't know if maybe a small part of me thought that I might be able to reason with them, but that didn't happen. Quite the opposite. I think there were about 96 people who reacted in this way, which is a massive number. But in comparison to how many people reacted to the whole piece, it's relatively small. But I messaged about 30 of them. About 10 of them got back, and about 8 of those properly engaged. But when I say engaged, I mean they responded to me, and then I sent them statistics, facts. I didn't just bombard them with that. I kind of opened up a conversation with them first. But yeah, they doubled down really. They didn't listen, and they just kind of, if anything, they got more and more angry about the situation. That was across the board.
What was the situation they were angry about? And obviously there's the whole Brexit. It was obviously weaponised. Nigel Farage's famous breaking point poster, migration into the EU. Did they understand that by leaving the EU, we didn't have the same level of border security? We now have the sovereignty. It stops at our borders. Was there any sense they felt things had got worse from Brexit, the government was being weak, or that they'd been kind of sold a lie?
To be frank, the conversation wasn't really able to get to that point because they kept sort of peddling out the same kind of everyone coming over is a criminal, everyone's a rapist, everyone's a murderer, they're stealing the jobs, stuff that was demonstrably false. But as soon as I tried to challenge those points, they didn't shut down. They kind of doubled down on that, but eventually they did just kind of most of the conversations ended up with them telling me where to go, to be honest. But in terms of the Brexit debate, you raised a very good point, because obviously before we left the European Union, one of the guys in particular was going on about passing through safe countries, and I think it was under Dublin 3. Actually, somewhat ironically, the UK had more tools at its disposal to return failed asylum seekers to the first safe country they reached. The definition of safe is up for debate as well. One person's safe isn't another person's. So, yeah, but to be honest, the conversation couldn't quite get to that point, and I'm pretty confident that if it had, they wouldn't have listened to that either.
So the same point you make about that they're not generally migrants, those who seek asylum here, about 70% get it. So none of this made any impact. These were real people, these weren't trolls, these weren't anonymous. And yet, what would you say of the percentage? You said 90, 80 or 90 negative responses. How many were positive? What would you say, 30%, 20%, 10% or more?
As in, how many were positive to my messages or to the original post?
Of the whole commentary on your Kent Online and your follow-up article, what percentage would you say that Kent readers and residents of Kent Online were sympathetic to the plight of these people who drowned in the Channel?
I honestly think probably about 90% of people were positive and sympathetic, and that's probably been upped by the story this week. I have had a lot of emails, and only one of them's been negative. There's been a few negative comments, but nothing like the number of positive comments. Probably the percentage goes down when we look back at stories we've done in the past. So yeah, I think it's important to emphasise more for my own sanity, really, that most people are quite decent. But yeah, obviously, it's still very important to challenge the vocal minority that have these entrenched views, which are just repulsive.
And covering a beat such as Kent when it comes to issues of migration and refugees and Brexit, I mean, like you say, it's probably 10% of people who have quite negative views around these topics. But just in terms of your insight about what maybe motivates some of those views, what would you say are the main reasons from your experience of covering this area?
Yeah, from experience and from the messages that I was getting back this week, I think the thing that there's many factors at play, but a lot of the comments coming back echoed recent government rhetoric around the issue. Going back to that passing through safe countries thing, that's a line that's been sent out by the Home Office in official releases. Spokesmen are quoted saying that, so there's not really much to debate there. That's what they've said, and it's not accurate. So that's been, it's easy to blame these people for, laughing at the death of dozens of people, and obviously that's horrendous. But it's important to look at how they got to that point, and if they're peddling, if they're repeating those lines, you've kind of got to look at the obvious place, which is if they're hearing that on the TV, if they're hearing that from politicians, then that's going to feed their hatred. I don't blame the government entirely, but I'm just that particular point, especially about safe route, or sorry, not safe routes, about passing through safe countries. That's been repeated time and time again by the Home Office. And then if you look at some of the more extreme views, there's obviously, like I think you mentioned earlier, the Breaking Point poster. There's been Katie Hopkins in the past calling refugees cockroaches, that kind of thing. They have access to that information, and unfortunately that sticks with them. Those kind of sound bites.
Wed, thank you so much for calling some of this behaviour out and trying to challenge it. I think it does make a difference, and all those of us in journalism and in the media need to do our part in doing that. So thank you, and cheers for joining us this evening.
No worries at all. Thank you. Cheers.
Great to have some local journalists, Hardeep, especially blood, isn't it, of British journalists and people starting those kind of beats, Kent Online and things. So kudos to Ed for doing that. So, coronavirus, of course, nobody wants lockdowns, nobody likes wearing masks, but we do it to protect others. We're now joined by Dr Deepti Gurdasani from Mary College, University of London, Mary College, sorry, I always get
Queen
that.
Mary's
Queen
University
Mary
of
College.
London.
I had my booster yesterday, and I'm still a bit lagged by that. And Deepti is an epidemiologist who throughout the last year has been guiding us, particularly not on other mainstream media, but also us, of what's happening in the world of coronavirus and the spread of it, and has had brilliant insights and predictions. Thanks for joining us, Deepti.
Thanks for having me.
So, Deepti, maybe just explain to a lay audience why it's called this new variant, it's called Omicron, and what's the difference between this variant and the other mutations? Obviously, mutations are happening all the time, that's what viruses do. What's particularly concerning about this variant after, I think it was about this time last year, wasn't it? The other big variation was Delta.
So Omicron is just being named sort of on the Greek alphabet, like other variants have been. In terms of what's worrying about it, it's a variant that has probably twice as many mutations, so differences from the original variant than Delta had. So it's a variant that's very, very different from our original variant. And these mutations, a lot of them have been observed in other variants, some of them haven't. And what we know about them in the laboratory is that some of them are associated with greater transmissibility of the virus, and some of them are associated with greater escape from previous immunity. The really alarming thing about this variant is the rapidity with which it's grown in Gauteng province and then across the rest of South Africa. And it's now sort of doubling in cases every 2 days or so. And that increase has also been accompanied by an increase in hospitalizations that appear to be more than doubling every week. And both of those things together are very concerning.
So just to explain again to the lay audience, this mutation you think is more transmissible. This is from the data we've got already. And so laboratory tests combined with data from South Africa and causes more severe illness. in people? Do we know what proportion of those in South Africa, we don't know, originated there? They just have a very good, don't they, sort of genetic profiling. They're the first that shared a lot of data from South Africa. Do we know if it's particularly affecting people who have not been vaccinated, or is also, as you call it, vaccine escape, people who've had Delta before, that's one form of immunity, or who've been vaccinated? Do we have any new information on that?
So we know that this variant has an advantage over the Delta variant, which was prominent in South Africa until now. We don't know the reasons why. It looks like a big part of the reason is escape from previous immunity. So what South African researchers have shown in a very short time is that there's an increased level of reinfection of people who've been exposed to other variants in the past with this particular variant. And that wasn't seen with previous variants. So it suggests that even if you've been infected before, you don't have that level of protection that you're expected to have against this particular variant. And that's a major area of advantage. Whether there's a transmissibility advantage over Delta or not isn't known yet. And whether there's increased risk among those people who are vaccinated and what that increased risk looks like isn't known yet. We also don't know about the severity of disease, but we do know that hospitalizations are rising rapidly in Gauteng. So they're more than doubling every week, which is concerning. And we know that there's a lag between cases and hospitalizations and deaths. So we will not realize the full impact of this until the coming weeks. But it is very, very clear that this is a variant that can spread rapidly and can also overwhelm health services, given that hospitalizations are increasing, particularly in young people and young children. And you know, Gauteng and South Africa are doing work now to expand their pediatrics ICU capacity. So all of that should tell us that this is concerning. And yes, we don't know how well vaccines will protect us against them. Hopefully they will protect against severe disease, how well boosters will protect against them. So we can't fully predict the impact in the UK. But what we can say is, as per the reports from the UK today, this variant, although at very low levels in the UK, is also growing rapidly here with a growth rate of about 2.5-fold every week. And we know that those sort of exponential rises, even when you start with small numbers, can mean you get to very high levels very quickly.
Become accustomed in this country really to mixed messaging from the government. So on one hand, we've had quite sort of, a rapid response in some ways from Boris Johnson, saying that masks are now compulsory on public transport and in shops. But then we've had all these other comments, some of them affected by other media reports about what was or wasn't going on last year, saying that people shouldn't cancel Christmas parties, but if they do have them, don't kiss anyone, and there should only be 6 people. What do you make of the government response? Is it enough, or do you think, as with last year, as we get closer to Christmas, there's going to have to be a tightening in the communications that we're getting around the spread of this variant?
So first of all, I don't think that's a rapid response. I think wearing masks on transport and shops is the bare minimum. And almost no other Western European country, or pretty much any country across the world, except perhaps Sweden or the Netherlands, sort of did that. And at a point in time where we were having 50,000 cases a day, we should have done that anyway to save lives, because we've lost about 15,000 people since Freedom Day, many of whom could have been saved with simple things like mask mandates. So I think it doesn't even scratch the surface of what we need to be doing to deal with this threat. I mean, they were quick to impose travel bans just to South Africa, despite the fact this was widespread. But, what are they going to do with the time that they bought in slowing import? They don't appear to be doing anything with a variant that seems to be rapidly rising in South Africa and increasing in frequency here. We know it's small numbers, but this is time for us to critically bring cases down, to develop capacity in hospitals. But we seem to be squandering it at a point where our NHS is already in crisis, our ambulances are already on black alert, and people are already dying in the backs of ambulances. We are in crisis now. We cannot deal with another threat. We should be taking very, very strong action, including putting mitigations in school, having mask mandates with high-grade masks provided by government in many more spaces, having very good support for isolation, rolling out vaccines to younger children. And we seem to be relying once again on the vaccine-only strategy. Boosting is a hugely important part. But while we're boosting, we need to buy time with other measures. And we have extremely high case rates and death rates, and we've had these for about 18 weeks. And I think that's what most people don't seem to realize. We've been in a crisis situation for 18 weeks, so it seems normal. But this isn't normal at all. The number of people we've lost, number of lives we've lost in the last 18 weeks is higher than every other Western European country. And they are responding to the crises that they have right now. We're doing absolutely nothing and pretending that, this is the new normal. But you can't wish Omicron away, and it's going to spread and it's going to increase like it is in other parts of the world, and we're not preparing for it.
Well, as always, Deepti, you've been the voice of sanity, a voice of precaution, but the precautionary principle should reign in science. And I think the good news is, if there's a little bit of good news, people do listen to you. We take our own personal protections and our own cautions, and the public are often ahead of the government. So thank you for all you've done this year. Hopefully we'll speak to you in better times next year.
Thank you.
Now, the Omicron variant is obviously very concerning for us all, and the coronavirus has already taken so many people's lives in this country. But as is often the case, this week, the headlines in Westminster were once again dominated by something that revolves around our Prime Minister and his very particular rule-breaking personality. Reports and rumours of a staff party being held at Downing Street around this time last year, once Tier 3 restrictions have been introduced in the capital to stop the spread of the coronavirus, have swept through Westminster and again raised questions about one rule for the government and one rule for everybody else. Now, Boris Johnson has said that even though the party took place, no restrictions and no rules were broken. But is that really the case? And what about the opposition parties? Are they finally capitalising on this, or is it just one event in many which will finally have a hit on the Prime Minister? Well, earlier, our producer, George Llewellyn, spoke to our chief Westminster correspondent, Adam Bienkov, who has the inside track on this latest scandal.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. So first of all, for those who don't know, can you just explain to me what the revelations were that kind of came out in the Mirror article and the accusation that Keir Starmer put to Boris Johnson in Prime Minister's Questions this week?
Yes, so the Daily Mirror reported earlier this week that last year the Prime Minister attended an event in November, a leaving do for a colleague, when the country was in its second national lockdown, and that there was a second event in December during when London was in the Tier 3 restrictions. Neither of these events, it appears, would have been legal under the law at the time, and the Prime Minister and his staff were accused of breaking the lockdown rules. There was no immediate denial from Downing Street, and there's continued to be no denial from Downing Street that these parties took place, but they insist that no COVID rules were broken. But again, we've had no confirmation of exactly why they believe those rules were not broken. This was raised by Keir Starmer and Ian Blackford, the SNP leader in Westminster, at Prime Minister's Questions. And again, they got no real denial from the Prime Minister. He attempted to deflect from the issue and move on to other subjects, but neither himself nor his spokespeople after Prime Minister's Questions really had any answers as to why these events took place, or even if these events took place, and why if they did take place, why they didn't break the lockdown rules.
As millions of people were locked down last year, was a Christmas party thrown in Downing Street for dozens of people on December the 18th?
Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during number 10.
And from your perspective, given that this was, this party on the 18th of December was 2 days after London went into Tier 3, and the day before Boris Johnson kind of scrapped the plans to ease restrictions at Christmas. From your perspective, is there any kind of possibility that this gathering of kind of 40 or so people with drinking, with party games, all of that kind of stuff, is there a way that could be have taken place within COVID restrictions?
Well, people were allowed to work together during this period. So these were all people that would been working together with each other on a daily basis anyway. And people were allowed to gather for work-related, for for work, essentially, people are allowed to gather inside. So that the only sort of possible defence for Downing Street was to say this was work-related event. They were, but the reporting from the Daily Mirror is that there was a Secret Santa, there was a quiz, there was a speech, there was alcohol. The event went on until after midnight. So it'd be very hard for them to defend on those grounds, which is probably why they're not attempting to defend it on those grounds, and they're just trying to stonewall the issue. And just, there was a remarkable exchange between the Prime Minister's spokespeople after Prime Minister's questions and journalists. Went on for about 5-10 minutes, in which they were just repeatedly asked the same questions, and they just came back with the same line that we don't recognise this account. But no COVID rules have been broken. I mean, that formulation, we don't recognise this account, is typically sort of rolled out by Downing Street and spokespeople everywhere, where they can't really deny the story. They don't want to confirm it either, so they just say that they don't recognise it, which sounds like a denial, but it doesn't. If you actually think about it, it doesn't really mean anything.
Obviously, this has become really quite a big story this week, but a lot of Conservatives obviously have kind of been rushing to defend Boris Johnson, with a lot of Conservative commentators kind of saying this is a party that took place a year ago. Why are Labour, why is Keir Starmer still talking about something that happened a year ago? Why does it still matter now?
Well, I think when it took place, or how long ago it took place, is really neither here nor there. The rules were in place last December and November. Most people in the country followed those rules. After tweeting the exchange between the Prime Minister's spokespeople and journalists yesterday, I was inundated with responses from people who said that they hadn't been able to see sick relatives during that period. They were isolated at home over Christmas and weren't able to see anybody. So I think it matters to people that the same rules that apply to them should apply to people in power. So whether or not it happened last week or it happened a year ago, I think is really neither here nor there.
And given that we have, obviously there's this new variant that we don't kind of know too much about that's causing a lot of concern. We've just kind of returned to mask mandates in shops. What is the risk that these kind of revelations now will impact the way that people view and treat further restrictions? We saw with kind of last year, Dominic Cummings and the trip to Barnard Castle, and a lot of kind of high profile people being seen to break the lockdown rules. And very quickly what followed was a lot of people seem to be kind of start taking the rules less seriously, taking their own liberties, making their own decisions. What impact do you think these revelations are going to have? And will we see something similar this Christmas?
Well, I spoke to Professor Susan Mitchie, who is an advisor on the government's SAGE committee, scientific advisor, who specialises in behavioural science. And she told me that one of the most damaging things that the government can do is to allow the perception that there's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. And that really does undermine behaviour. And there is some evidence to suggest that's what happened when Dominic Cummings was found to have taken his trip to Barnard Castle. We don't know whether this recent incident with Boris Johnson, whether that's had the same sort of cut through. I suspect that it hasn't, largely because that was something that emerged at the time. This is something that's happened a year later, so possibly, and we're not currently in lockdown, so it probably doesn't have quite as big an impact on the public as the Cummings incident did. However, it is the Prime Minister rather than Prime Minister's advisor, which potentially means it could have more of an impact than it might otherwise have done. We just don't know. We haven't seen any polling on that. But it's certainly the case that when people see politicians, I see Conservative MPs, for instance, in the House of Commons refusing to wear their masks, it is, if you're not inclined to wear a mask on public transport, it's a good excuse for you not to do so.
Do you think these kind of revelations, the fact that through the second and third lockdowns, there were multiple kind of leaving drinks, as they call it, at Downing Street. Do you think these kind of instances of the Prime Minister and people in politics breaking the rules is going to cut through with Conservative voters or people who may be against kind of mask mandates anyway, who aren't too keen on the restrictions or seem set to ignore it?
Well, I mean, as far as Conservative voters and mask mandates and COVID restrictions, actually, Conservative voters, polls suggest, aren't vastly different on these issues to Labour voters. In the UK, there's generally a very high instance of people respecting COVID rules and being in support of. So I don't think it's really going to make a. I don't think there's a real distinction between. I think most people believe the rules are there for their benefit and are willing to do anything they can to prevent death. So I don't think that in itself is really a distinguishing factor.
How tied is this issue to the culture war and the fact that when incidents like this sort of tend to crop up, we tend to see Conservatives and people more to the right kind of rallying around Boris Johnson and people more to the left kind of rightly, I think, outraged by what they're seeing. But the needle never really seems to change. Are we kind of just now, do you think, locked into this system where whatever Boris Johnson does, his supporters are kind of just going to defend him kind of in the electorate, but also in Parliament?
Well, I think actually, I mean, I think that has been the case. And I think as a politician throughout his career, he's been able to survive scandals that almost all other politicians wouldn't have been able to survive. We have started to see that kind of ebb away in the last couple of months, and his own approval ratings now. I mean, his approval ratings have never been stellar, but they've really taken a nosedive in since the summer. Partly, a lot of that is down to the recent scandals, the Owen Paterson scandal, his handling of that, various U-turns that he and his government have made. But there's also been a sort of longer term shift away from the government since the summer. Since he got a boost from the vaccine rollout, that seems to have faded. And we're kind of into the classic kind of midterm situation where governments start to lose a bit of support. And I think that's what we're seeing. But of course, he's always going to have a hardcore of supporters, particularly online, who will support him no matter what he does. And on an issue like this, as I say, I think the public generally are very supportive of mask mandates and very supportive of lockdown restrictions. But there is a kind of hardcore group of people online who are very opposed to it, and sort of a hardcore group of people within the Conservative Party and among Conservative MPs who are very opposed to it. There was a large rebellion on the vote, or a significant rebellion on the vote on mask mandates this week by Conservative MPs. And some of those are very angry with Boris Johnson for bringing in these new restrictions. So there's always going to be a hardcore people who use an issue, who try and rally around Boris Johnson on something like this as part of a wide agenda. But I think, as I say, I think broadly the public are pretty much in the centre ground. The public is quite different from that.
And just finally, sort of coming on to Keir Starmer, he's really starting to run with this. He seems to have kind of really shown up in recent weeks. Do you think the way that he's handling this, the way that he's tackling this is good? Do you think it's going to kind of win him back some support?
Well, I think certainly the complaint from lots of Labour supporters about Keir Starmer, one of the complaints about Keir Starmer in the last year or so, is that he hasn't been aggressive enough against the government and hasn't really had very strong attack lines against them. He's kind of hedged his bets. Certainly in terms of language, he's been a lot more aggressive on this issue and others, openly calling the government corrupt, for instance, recently, which is something that he probably wouldn't have done a few months ago.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says we should concentrate on what he's asking the country to do. We're asking the country to follow the rules. Yep. Now, the Prime Minister doesn't deny there was a Downing Street Christmas party last year. He's not denied it. He says no rules were broken. Both of those things can't be true, Prime Minister. He's taking the British public for fools. And as for following the rules, Prime Minister, it might be good just to look behind you when it comes to the question of masks. As ever, one rule for them, another rule for everybody else.
So I think he's definitely become more aggressive, but the Labour Party themselves are still very divided. Big row in the Labour Party this week about the reshuffle. Angela Rayner being sidelined, a lot of kind of people on the soft left of the party being sidelined. So he certainly has his problems as well. And if you look at the polls, even though there has been a big drop in support for the Conservative Party, it doesn't yet seem to have translated into a significant rise in support for the Labour Party. And I think Keir Starmer really has a lot of work to do. I mean, one of his previous communications director was interviewed this week, and he said they were actually quite worried a couple of months ago that there would be a leadership bid against him. I don't think there's going to be one anytime soon. I think the reshuffle shows that he has reasserted his authority, but he's got a long way to go to have any chance of getting rid of Boris Johnson at the next general election. You look at the polls now; they're pretty much neck and neck. You'd expect at this sort of mid-term for Labour really to be significantly ahead of the Conservatives if they've got any chance of winning majority at the next general election.
Well, Adam Bienkov, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, one of the things we always talk about at Byline TV, in fact, one of the reasons we started it up was the media's role in the current crisis in the country, or this slow-burning, what we'd call a form of political corruption. Now, we're joined to talk about these wider issues on the comfortable blue sofa by Professor Brian Cathcart, who writes brilliantly for Byline TV, and a newer Byline Times, and a newer writer for Byline Times, Mick Wright, who writes as brilliantly as Brian. But so my opening question is, we have a government led by an ex-journalist, Boris Johnson, wrote for the Telegraph, chicken feed of £250,000 a year, and Michael Gove. If they went, would we still have the same problem, i.e. they are creations of the media, and the source of this problem is not Johnson and Gove, they are just symptoms?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think we're in a historically unprecedented situation where the press is extraordinarily powerful, as powerful certainly as the government, and it is also mutually dependent with the government. The press depends on the government to protect it, to pass laws, to serve its interests, to speak up as it did today, to justify the Mail in the Meghan case.
Did they speak up?
They did, and they depend on the government in all sorts of ways. Subsidies. Yeah. I mean, all the way through, and the government depends on the press to protect it from criticism. So to tell lies about it, to cover up the stories it doesn't want told, to big up Johnson or whichever ministers are needing bigging up, and this connection is mutual. They know that they're extreme people. They know that the press knows it's extreme, it's hard right, it's racist, it's all of those things. The government knows it's an extreme government. This is completely out of kilter with British history, and they cling to each other. Now, there is no line between them. That's a really important thing. I was asked years and years. Students would ask, is the government responsible for this or the press responsible for this? In the past, you might have been able to tell, but there's no difference between them now. They are the same people, as you say. The Prime Minister is a journalist. Michael Gove is a journalist. There are people from the press in Downing Street. There are people from the Tory party all over the press. There's no difference, and they also share a background in Oxbridge. They're mates. They're married to each other. We talk about this Christmas party business. I'd be amazed if there weren't journalists taking part in that party. Partly because they're married to each other and they're boyfriends and girlfriends. They're partners. They're whatever. And it's so incestuous. It's so close, and that is unprecedented in our history, and it is incredibly toxic. I mean, if you think of the power of the government to protect, the power of the press to protect this government from criticism, we haven't seen that before.
Because that was always billed as the fourth estate was like the antibodies against political corruption. Can I just ask Mick a question? I'm sure Hardeep want to follow up. You're slightly younger than Brian, and you came into the industry, something like 15, 20 years ago. The industry was already losing money then. So, I mean, what are the findings? And Brian pointed out, has written about it, how they got VAT reductions on their online sales. They got big subsidies to take government advertising. We have seen a Saudi, perhaps government-linked advertising campaign in a supposedly independent paper. Did you see this when you came into the world of journalism, Mick, that there was already some project there which wasn't about a commercial product, sell papers, but please the proprietors who have some other commercial interests?
Well, see, the thing is, I agree with Brian on a lot of things, but I'm really cautious about using the word unprecedented, because I think the precedent starts around the time that Rupert Murdoch enters the British media in 1969, when he takes the News of the World, and then in the 80s when he does the deal with Thatcher to have her enable him to take over the Times, Sunday Times, get rid of the monopoly laws that were there to prevent him from owning that amount of the press. It starts there and it continues through the Blair era and it continues to now. And I think a lot of the time the way we talk about this is that the Johnsonite world is very different, but I don't think it is. I think it's just a continuation. I think the precedent starts a long time ago. And for me, working in journalism, well, look, I don't come from a well-off family. I went to Cambridge, but I was the first in my family to go to any university. So when I came out of Cambridge, I was offered jobs at big titles, but they wanted me to be an intern. I couldn't do that. So I went and worked for a financial trade publication to start with. And that was very old school traditional journalism. It's like, you know, because I think it's in some ways why the FT is still very successful and actually probably the most closest to representing the reality amongst the mainstream papers, because finance people want to know what the world is as it is because they need to make calls, big money calls. So they want to be presented the world as it is. The other papers, not so much. That's not the angle they're coming from. Whether from The Guardian to The Times to The Sun, it's all a version of the world.
And just one more thing before Hardeep. The difference is, though, if you're saying this is a culmination of that process, particularly in 81, the deal with Thatcher to take over the Times, to avoid monopoly law, he did make money. You know, Murdoch basically financed Fox News Network, bought Metro Media out of the profits he's make out of whopping by combining those titles. None of these papers make money now, Mick. I suppose that's the difference to me.
The Mail makes money.
The Times makes money.
But the Times has started to make money. The Sun doesn't. The Telegraph doesn't. But then, you know, papers aren't about money, are they? The papers are about power. Papers are about, you know, you look to America and look to why does Jeff Bezos buy a paper? He buys a paper because a paper means something as a rich man. You buy a paper, or a rich woman even, you know, whatever, but usually rich men. You buy a paper, it means something. It's a projection of power. It's like, you know, like Clausewitz said about, like, you know, war is, you know, politics by other means. Newspapers are politics by other means. They're a means of projecting power. They're not about money. You don't buy them to make money. It's like you don't buy football clubs to make money. Roman Abramovich didn't buy Chelsea to make money. He pours money into it, but it gives him status. Papers are about status. They used to be about status still as well. The money thing is like I think it's a historical, you know, anomaly. There's a period where they made money. They don't anymore.
My take on it, Peter.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say, Hardeep, can I just explain a little bit about this? You know, I came into journalism 10 years ago now from a sort of career, probably easier career, maybe not, in drama and feature writing. And I sort of arrived at phone hacking trial, Leveson. I arrived at a moment of what I could see institutional corruption and monopoly and all those problems. And I've kind of got inured to it. But Hardeep, you feel that if Boris Johnson goes, our next subject is what?
Well, it's a subject that's always been our subject on Byline Times, and it's the main reason it exists, in that in our final analysis, one of the biggest threats to democracy and justice in this country are very powerful elements of the mainstream media. It's an extraordinary thing to say, but it's an unsurprising thing to say, as Mick has brought up. But I think, for me, you know, I started at a local newspaper. I went to journalism school, did a degree in a different subject like law. I didn't ever think that journalism was for me or something I could ever do. But yeah, I worked up from local newspapers, and what I've seen of sort of the mainstream media is still what we do in our work today, that actually, and I've seen it even more since we've been doing Byline Times and the response to it at times, it's a closed circuit, you know, it's not necessarily looking for new blood or people who are genuinely free thinking or don't fit into any one box. And it's interesting, the stories that stay with you and the interviews that stay with you. And just before, a week before the 2019 general election, I remember sitting down with the now former Labour MP for Wrexham, Ian Lucas, who's actually written a book that's going to be published on digital gangsters for Byline Books. But anyway, I sat down with him. It was essentially his last week as an MP in Parliament. Before he left, he was giving an interview about sort of the work he'd done. I think he'd been an MP for a number of years. And one of the things that has always stayed with me was he said, about the media, about the mainstream broadcasters, the BBC, all the establishment media, he said, yeah, I knew they were never really interested in someone like me. So, even all the work he did on around fake news and all this stuff, he was like, they're not interested in people like me. I don't go to the dinner parties, I'm not part of the circuit. And Ian is a man he's an Oxford-educated lawyer, who's a man who's white, who said, I don't fit into that world. Why would they want to come and interview me? And I tell you, I will never forget that. I wrote it up as an interview. It's still on Byline Times for people to read. I'll never forget that, because I just thought, I looked at Ian and I thought, if that's how you feel, my God, what about everyone else who's nowhere close to having the foundations that, Ian does? And I think it just sums up to me that, there's only so far you can get if this system is closed to you.
So we are running a bit out of time, but the good news is if you sign up, and it's pretty cheap, we'll carry on this conversation about 9 o'clock in our After Dark section. Very busy edition, and also a very profound subject here, which we would want to talk a lot and more about. So do join us in about 7 minutes. But before we go, I just ask you both, is this sustainable? I mean, in a way, we don't want it to end, I'm joking, because this is our business. But just ask you briefly, do you think that this can carry, or will it collapse? It's such a narrow, I'll start with you, Brian, yes, such a narrow number of people, they can't afford to be a journalist. If you don't have property in central London, if your parent hasn't got a trust fund for you, how could you even start? And let alone the symbiosis. That's a very dangerous thing, that symbiosis.
Terribly dangerous, yeah.
Can it survive? And do you think it ends with a bang or a whimper?
Well, I believe in journalism. And I feel it kind of like the force of gravity, that there's something that will, as it were, drag everything down to straight lines again, as it were. And so, yes, I kind of have a faith, which is not founded in any reason at all, that journalism must triumph, and that people trying to tell the truth will be, will be accepted and recognised, whereas the untrustworthy liars and fabricators will be acknowledged. So, I have it's a simple, crude view of the world, faith, that at some point we'll hit a tripwire, and people will start to say, look, we don't trust these journalists. Why are we reading them? Why are we listening to them? Why are we looking at their stuff on TV? Why? Let's try and find the truth.
So, Mick, do you have that faith? The question is, do they trust no journalism and go to QAnon and things like that? And do you think it will? There's a sort of implosive mechanism in place here that the house of cards will collapse, or just carry on and get worse? Or maybe you don't know either way.
I think that the world is going to get a lot harder, and I think in a world where there are profound crises that it's no longer possible to pretend aren't happening, then I'm of the same mind as Brian, that in that situation real journalism becomes more, people will start to see very profoundly these crises cannot be avoided, they cannot be ignored, they're still being ignored now, and at that point real journalism can come back. I think also there's a lot of amazing journalists now. You look in the papers, even the papers that we decry a lot of the time, there are some brilliant journalists working in them. Those are not the stories that then get put into broadcast a lot of times. I don't want to dismiss everyone working on a national. There are some amazing journalists on there, but the ones that have the balls and the guts and the drive to stay true to what they really believe in, they hit a level.
Yeah, and it's worth reminding everybody, we never on Byline Times distrust journalists. We employ them, and on Byline TV as much as we possibly can, and there has to be brilliant stories in all the mainstream press, even on the Crony contracts. They are somewhat buried on their front page, and not on the front pages, and not followed up by mainstream broadcasters. But we will follow them up. So, If people sign up, what happens, Hardeep? We have to go, but if they sign up...
You can join us after the show. In about 10 minutes' time, we'll be doing our After Dark Q&A. The four of us will be here to answer all the questions we didn't manage to get through in the show. So please do that. But for now, thank you to our guests. Peter and I will be back at 8 p.m. next Friday. And until then, we wish you a very good week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.